Moving from a static product model to transactional execution, the end-to-end workers' compensation lifecycle in Guidewire PolicyCenter begins with the submission transaction. This process establishes a commercial account using unique identifiers like the FANE. The user then maps out all physical business locations, which is critical because WC benefits are legally tied to where an employee routinely works. The submission wizard guides the user through mapping covered employees, class codes, and estimated payrolls, alongside supplemental question sets evaluating workplace hazards. Upon completion, the system triggers the core rating engine to calculate initial premiums and routes the transaction through underwriting queues if high-risk referral rules are tripped. Once bound, the policy enters its midterm life cycle, adapting dynamically to business changes via policy change or endorsement transactions. This is triggered when an employer opens new out-of-state facilities or expands their workforce mid-year. PolicyCenter manages these modifications by creating chronologically split segments within the policy term, calculating prorated premium changes for the remainder of the active period. Similarly, if premium payments fail or risk profiles degrade, the system manages cancellations and reinstatements, enforcing strict statutory state notice periods and executing short-rate or pro-rata premium distributions to ensure total legal compliance. The true differentiator for the workers' comp life cycle occurs upon expiration, which triggers a mandatory final audit job instead of a basic close. Because initial premiums are based on estimates, PolicyCenter automatically instantiates an audit workflow to reconcile historical exposure. Based on premium thresholds, the system orchestrates physical or voluntary mail audits to capture the insured's actual audited payroll figures per class code. Once these true values are recorded, PolicyCenter re-rates the expired term to determine the final earned premium delta and fires a transactional message downstream to BillingCenter to either issue an audit inverse for immediate cash collection or generate a credit memo for overpayment. For a business analyst, success relies on establishing airtight validation guardrails and protecting data lineage across these job types. The business analyst must define rules preventing users from modifying historical data segments during midterm updates, which would otherwise corrupt the final audit. Additionally, the business analyst must meticulously map how payroll data flows from the initial submission, through active endorsements, and directly into the audit screens. By safeguarding this data lineage and leveraging native transaction workflows, the team delivers a legally compliant, automated core platform. Mastering Guidewire PolicyCenter's out-of-the-box data model allows a business analyst to bridge the gap between requirements and configuration. Every rule maps to a specific entity, starting with the PolicyPeriod. The PolicyPeriod acts as the root transaction wrapper for the system, containing all data for a specific effective and expiration term. It serves as the single source of truth for the policy state, tracking whether a transaction is a submission, policy change, or renewal. Branching beneath this root is the WorkersCompLine entity, representing the core line of business container. It acts as a global bucket for properties, parameters, and baseline exclusions that apply to the entire policy. A business analyst leverages the WorkersCompLine to manage high-level configurations before state-specific variations are applied. Because workers' compensation is dictated by statutory laws, the data model introduces the WCJurisdiction entity to handle geographic segmentation. For every state where an employer operates, PolicyCenter instantiates a separate WCJurisdiction row. This entity encapsulates state-specific taxes, regulatory surcharges, and localized validation rules. If a carrier writes a policy covering multiple territories, the WCJurisdiction dictates the compliance workflows and rating variations required by each local government. It ensures that state-mandated timelines, underwriting rules, and local premium modifications, such as the experience modification factor, are cleanly separated, preventing a multi-state policy from collapsing into flat fields. Directly linked to the jurisdiction is the WC-COV-EMP table, known as the Covered Employee Table. This entity functions as the primary exposure engine for the product model where financial calculations begin. Within this table, PolicyCenter stores attributes including physical location, state, number of employees, estimated annual payroll, and the foundational 4-digit class codes. For a business analyst, the WCJurisdiction entity is the focal point of user interface mapping, representing the screen grids where users input payroll estimations. The estimated payroll establishes the initial premium footprint, which remains locked until the final audit transaction reconciles these numbers. To accommodate technical risks, the data model includes the WC occupational disease subentity. This specialized table is utilized when a carrier provides specific coverage variations or endorsements for diseases that develop over extended periods, common in sectors like mining. A business analyst must identify when a requirement falls into this category to configure these records without polluting the standard covered employee table. By understanding how PolicyPeriod, WorkersCompLine, WCJurisdiction, WCJurisdiction, and WC occupational disease interlock, a business analyst in workers' compensation insurance, risk calculation is fundamentally tied to operational exposure, which is categorized through a system of class codes. These 4-digit numeric identifiers are maintained by regulatory bodies like the National Council on Compensation Insurance or independent state bureaus. Every employee's daily duties must map to an appropriate class code so the carrier can evaluate workplace hazards. For instance, Code 8810 is used for clerical office employees whose exposure to physical injury is statistically low, whereas Code 5645 is utilized for residential carpentry, which carries a much higher probability of accidents. Assigning these codes precisely prevents the misclassification of risk, ensuring that a low-risk office is not rated on the same scale as a high-risk manual labor environment. Within Guidewire PolicyCenter, a business analyst is responsible for determining how these class codes are stored and retrieved. The product model must be configured with a robust framework, which typically manifests as an internal system table, a type list mapping, or an integration with an external regulatory database. When a user selects a specific class code on the covered employee's screen, PolicyCenter must automatically infer cascading attributes. These include the base hazard group, which ranges from categories A through G, and the corresponding risk severity tier. This automation is critical because users should not manually input hazard groups. Instead, the system must utilize the data model to enforce these relationships natively, reducing entry errors and accelerating the quoting process. A business analyst must define the validation rules and cross-classification logic that govern these class codes across different jurisdictions. Because a single class code might have a different baseline rate or hazard group classification depending on the state, the system must validate the code against the active jurisdiction entity. The business analyst needs to design the user interface screens to ensure that when a class code is selected, the system filters the available options based on the state of the physical location. Furthermore, the analyst must account for unique scenarios like governing classifications, where the dominant operations of a business dictate the baseline code, and exception classifications, which apply to specific clerical or sales roles. This ensures the development team constructs the appropriate validation logic. Ultimately, the accuracy of the class code data model directly impacts downstream processes, particularly the core rating engine and the final audit workflow. The 4-digit code serves as the primary lookup value used by the rating engine to retrieve the correct base rate per $100 of payroll exposure. If the business analyst fails to establish an airtight mapping between the class code, the hazard group, and the end-to-end core policy lifecycle for workers' compensation within Guidewire PolicyCenter is structured around a sequence of transactional jobs that dynamically alter the state of a policy contract. This operational journey begins with the submission flow, which represents the new business acquisition phase. The process initiates with account creation, where a business analyst must ensure the system captures foundational legal entity details, including the exact legal name, the corporate headquarters address, and the Federal Employer Identification Number. The Federal Employer Identification Number is a vital identifier used downstream to check for duplicate accounts and ensure compliance with regulatory reporting. Following account creation, the user progresses to the Policy Info screen to capture the policy effective and expiration dates, organization type, such as a corporation or limited liability company, and the designated producer codes that attribute commission to the correct agency. The subsequent stage in the submission flow is the location screen, which is exceptionally critical for workers' compensation due to the localized nature of the risk. A business analyst must design this screen to capture every physical location where the insured operates, mapping each unique address to a policy location entity. Because workers' compensation benefits are legally determined by the specific state and territory where an employee routinely reports to work, accurate location data forms the baseline for all state-specific coverage validation. Next, the process moves to the inclusion and exclusion screen, where the system documents whether executive officers, partners, or specific family members are legally included in or excluded from coverage, directly modifying the final exposure base. Once locations and individuals are defined, the user enters the core workers' compensation coverage and state-specific details screen. Here, PolicyCenter establishes the active jurisdictions based on the locations entered, mapping covered employees to their respective physical locations. Users input the estimated annual payroll and select the appropriate 4-digit class codes for these worker groups. To further refine the risk profile, the submission wizard presents prior history and supplemental screens containing structured question sets. These questions evaluate specific workplace hazards, such as whether employees perform high-altitude roofing or underground mining. After completing these screens, the system invokes the rating engine to calculate initial estimated premiums and triggers automated underwriting referral rules if any high-risk answers or class codes are detected, routing the policy to an underwriter queue for formal binding. After a policy is successfully bound and active, it enters the midterm modification phase to adapt to the evolving realities of the insured business. This is managed through policy change jobs, commonly known endorsement. When modernizing Guidewire PolicyCenter for a workers' compensation implementation, standard out-of-the-box user interfaces almost always require targeted configurations to align with carrier guidelines and regional statutory demands. The system renders all visible views, screens, and fields using page configurer files, commonly known as PCF files. For workers' compensation projects, a business analyst frequently alters key PCF layouts, most notably the WC option card panel set and the WC COVI MPLV. The WC option card panel set PCF is the primary container used to manage optional coverage falling outside standard statutory rules, such as voluntary compensation or foreign voluntary compensation, allowing carriers to extend benefits to exempt employee categories. Meanwhile, the WC COVI MPLV is a specialized list view layout that displays the data grid where underwriters add, delete, and modify rows containing distinct class codes, locations, and estimated payrolls. Tailoring this list view ensures that the data entry process is intuitive, data validation triggers instantly upon field changes, and users can navigate heavy data volumes efficiently during the submission wizard. Beyond visual layout adjustments, a business analyst must expand the underlying database structure by designing common data model extensions. Because out-of-the-box entities provide a generic foundation, carriers require unique attributes to execute their proprietary underwriting guidelines. To bridge this gap, the business analyst authors comprehensive field-level specifications, which detail the exact technical parameters required to append custom fields to standard entities like the covered employee table or the jurisdiction table. For example, a business analyst might write a specification to add a safety program discount boolean to the state jurisdiction entity, which automatically grants a premium credit if the employer maintains validated workplace safety training. Each field specification must explicitly define the field label, database data type, visibility constraints, editability logic, and corrective validation rules, ensuring all custom data elements are cleanly integrated into the native Guidewire data architecture. In tandem with extending data entities, a business analyst must configure type lists, which are the out-of-the-box drop-down menus used throughout the application to enforce data standardization and clean entry. For workers' compensation implementations, two critical type lists that routinely undergo modification are governing law and audit method. The governing law type list is extended to support various regulatory frameworks, enabling the user to distinguish between standard state-specific workers' compensation acts and specialized federal acts, such as the Longshore and Harbor Workers' Compensation Act, which applies to maritime employees. The audit method type list is configured to map the operational parts for the final audit job, containing core values. To manage workers' compensation insurance effectively, Guidewire PolicyCenter cannot operate in an isolated environment and requires a highly coordinated network of external data feeds and downstream integrations. One of the most critical integration touchpoints is the interface with the National Council on Compensation Insurance or individual state bureaus, which is designed to automate the retrieval of the experience modification factor. This factor functions as a statistical multiplier reflecting an employer's historical loss and claims record compared to the baseline average of other businesses operating within the same industry sector. An experience modification factor of 1.0 signifies an average risk profile. A factor below 1.0 indicates a safe history that earns a premium discount, and a factor above 1.0 indicates a high loss history that will increase the policy premium. Manually verifying these scores across hundreds of risks would create massive operational bottlenecks, making a seamless system-to-system integration an absolute necessity for modern core platforms. The technical execution of this data exchange relies on automated system triggers embedded natively within the PolicyCenter transaction lifecycles. When an underwriting user initiates a new business submission or triggers a policy renewal term, the system automatically aggregates a data payload containing the unique business entity identifiers, specifically the Federal Employer Identification Number and the designated state locations. This data package is dispatched via an application programming interface directly to the external bureau database. The bureau architecture processes the incoming request, utilizes the identification number to locate the matching corporate account profile, and returns a verified response containing the official experience modification factor alongside its associated valuation dates. If an employer has operations spanning multiple territories, the system is designed to parse state-specific values to ensure alignment with localized rating rules. Once the response payload is successfully received by PolicyCenter, it directly impacts the underlying data model layer and modifies the user interface behavior. The system parses the inbound text and updates the experience modification field residing inside the WCJurisdiction entity for each active state. To preserve absolute data integrity and prevent unauthorized rate tampering, PolicyCenter invokes a native validation rule that immediately locks this field on the screen, making it completely read-only for standard users. The application will only allow a deviation from this automated score if a senior underwriter possessing elevated authority overrides the system block, which automatically records a mandatory audit log. This finalized value is then ingested by the core rating engine, acting as a critical multiplier that alters the calculated subject premium. The secondary critical integration point required for a compliant workers' compensation system rollout is the proof of coverage reporting mechanism. In the United States, almost every state mandates that carriers report policy verification details immediately upon binding a contract. This statutory requirement ensures that local labor boards can verify employers are maintaining active policies, preventing companies from violating mandatory workers' compensation laws. Within Guidewire PolicyCenter, this is achieved through an event-fired messaging engine that listens to the PolicyPeriod transaction. The moment a submission, renewal, or reinstatement transitions to bound, the messaging engine automatically instantiates an outbound message payload. This architectural trigger runs in the background, ensuring data transmission occurs without manual intervention, eliminating the risk of missed regulatory timelines. The outbound data package compiled by PolicyCenter contains specific fields required by state laws to uniquely identify the risk profile. This payload transmits the employer legal name, the corporate structure classification, and the federal employer identification number, which serves as the primary relational key across national insurance databases. Additionally, the system pulls the precise addresses of all active locations mapped within the policy period tables and pairs them with their corresponding coverage effective and expiration dates. This structured payload is sent downstream via secure protocols to state regulatory databases or specialized clearinghouses, such as the International Association of Industrial Accident Boards and Commissions. These entities parse the data to update public registries, allowing state inspectors to instantly verify the active coverage status of any business operating within their borders. Beyond regulatory compliance, workers' compensation excellence demands airtight synchronization between core applications, specifically manifested in the final audit synchronization between Guidewire PolicyCenter and Guidewire BillingCenter. When a final audit transaction job transitions to a completed state within PolicyCenter, the system must immediately transmit the audited financial realities downstream to update the accounting ledgers. Throughout the active policy term, all invoicing schedules are driven by the estimated payroll numbers captured during the initial submission phase. However, once the audit process captures the true payroll figures across all class codes, PolicyCenter aggregates a specific transaction payload highlighting the financial difference between the initial estimated premium and the newly calculated audited premium. This communication is handled via a built-in application integration framework that ensures absolute transactional integrity, maintaining an uncorrupted audit trail between policy structures and billing accounts. Upon receiving the financial payload from all center, the rating mechanics governing workers' compensation insurance within Guidewire PolicyCenter are multi-layered and jurisdiction-dependent, requiring a business analyst to map out each mathematical tier meticulously for the configuration team. Premium calculation moves through distinct progressive tiers where calculations must happen in an exact chronological order to ensure total compliance with state rating bureaus. The absolute foundation of the premium math starts with the manual premium calculation, which is executed across the covered employee table. For every class code assigned to a physical location, the rating engine divides the estimated annual payroll by 100 and multiplies that exposure basis by the approved base class code rate. The manual premium is the aggregate sum of these individual class code calculations across all exposure lines and active states. Once the manual premium is established, PolicyCenter applies the first layer of modifiers to determine the subject premium. This step modifies the baseline premium by multiplying the manual premium by the verified experience modification factor pulled automatically from the bureau integration. The resulting subject premium represents the raw risk of the employer before discretionary underwriting adjustments are applied. From there, the system evaluates the standard premium by introducing the schedule rating modifier. The schedule rating modifier functions as an underwriting judgment factor, allowing a credit or debit of up to 25% based on physical workplace conditions, specialized safety equipment, or overall management culture. If an employer maintains pristine safety protocols, the underwriter applies a credit modifier to lower the premium, whereas poor safety histories trigger a debit modifier that increases it. A final calculation layer transitions from the standard premium to the total estimated policy premium by factoring in structural fees, discounts, and state-mandated taxes. A critical component at this stage is the expense constant, which is a fixed administrative fee added to every policy contract to cover the carrier operating costs of issuing and servicing the account, regardless of the overall payroll size. The rating engine then subtracts premium discounts based on premium volume brackets, adds localized assessments managed by the jurisdiction entity, and outputs the final cost. A business analyst must ensure that the rate routines in PolicyCenter are mapped so that these final elements do not compound incorrectly, safeguarding the accuracy of the final financial payload sent downstream to the billing systems. Thanks for watching. I will post part 2 soon. Please subscribe. Thanks.